Hey guys, Edward here from Edward279, the mixed content creator. Now, at the time I'm recording this, my channel's second anniversary is tomorrow, and just like with last year, this year I'm celebrating with a special compilation, with this year's being themed around countries, languages, and flags, as the thumbnail would suggest. First up, a video explaining the most and least common colors on national flags, and why they're so rare or common. Flag colors. You might not think of flag colors as anything special, but some colors actually appear way more often on flags than others. So in today's video, we'll be ranking every flag color from least to most common in the flags of all 197 countries of the world. So without further ado, let's get started. As the least common color among the colors found in national flags, you'd expect purple to be on more than just 2 national flags. And even then, the only one in which the purple is even noticeable without zooming in is Dominica's with that purple parrot of theirs. But why is purple so rare, may you ask? The answer, its dye is expensive, and to understand why, we have to go back in time all the way to Byzantium, Greece, and Rome, in which a type of purple dye made from sea snails known as Tyrian purple was crazy expensive, at one point even being worth 3 times more than gold according to a Roman edict in 301 AD. And even after the fall of Rome, purple dye was, and probably still is, one of the most expensive colors in the world. So many new countries decided not to use purple and instead use more common colors like red, white, or green. Like I said earlier, purple is the least common color on countries' flags, with only 2 countries, Dominica and Nicaragua, using the color on their flags. Next up is the color gray, and no matter which way you spell it, it is rare on national flags. Now, unlike purple, whose use was restricted by its insane costs, gray is not common in flags for another reason. It's really hard to distinguish from a distance. Gray is a color that blends in really well when visibility is low, making a gray flag really hard to distinguish from a distance. This is important because flags need to be visible from large distances away, and more often than not, gray is avoided for blending into low visibility conditions too well. And instead, brighter and more contrasting colors like red and blue are used instead of gray, so that a flag can easily be seen even from far away in low visibility conditions. Gray is the second least common flag color among countries' flags, with only 7 countries, Bolivia, Ecuador, Eswatini, Guatemala, Spain, Uganda, and the Vatican, and having gray on their flags. Next up is a color that, again, isn't always noticeable on flags and is still relatively rare: brown. While not anywhere near as rare as purple or gray, brown is still relatively rare and is seldom the main color or one of the main colors of a flag. Historically, brown was the exact opposite of purple, being seen as low class and not very showy, but nowadays, brown can be used to symbolize a few things, like in the case of Bolivia, in which the brown is symbolic of the country's rich natural resources, and in some other cases, symbolizes the people's connection to the country's land. And even if a flag contains brown in it, chances are the color just about never appears in any national flag's official description, even in the case of countries like Mexico, Moldova, or Belize, which contain more brown in their flags than most other countries do. Brown is the third least common color in flags, with 11 national flags using it. Now, with how flashy, bright, and easy to see orange is, you might be surprised it's so rare, especially when compared to similar colors like red, which are comparatively everywhere. Well, there are actually a few reasons why. For one, it doesn't really blend that well with very many colors, with the only color orange really blends well with being white. Secondly, similar to purple, orange is on the more expensive side when it comes to colors, although orange is still not anywhere near as expensive as purple. Lastly, unlike some other symbolic colors, orange doesn't represent that much. So if symbolism is what a country is looking for in their flag, orange can easily be swapped out for red or some other their more common and more symbolic color. Orange is the fourth least common flag color in countries' flags, with 12 countries: Armenia, Bhutan, Cyprus, El Salvador, India, Ireland, the Ivory Coast, the Marshall Islands, Nicaragua, Niger, Peru, Sri Lanka, and Zambia using the country in their flag. While nowhere near as rare as purple, gray, or even orange, black is surprisingly rare on the world stage, especially since black is relatively easy to see and is comparatively a great flag color. And don't get me wrong, plenty of flags in the Middle East use black, like those of the Palestinian territories, Kuwait, Jordan, Egypt, Yemen, Iraq, Libya, the UAE, and Syria, as well as some flags in Europe like Germany, Albania, Belgium, and Estonia. After all, black makes a good flag color for a few reasons, one of which is symbolism, and the Middle East especially has close ties with the color black, as black is one of the four pan-Arab colors, and is the color of the Black Standard, which was historically used by both the Rashidun and Abbasid caliphates, and happens to be the flag that the Prophet Muhammad flew according to Islamic traditions. Black is quite a common sight among the flags of the world, especially in Middle Eastern flags, with the color being used in the flags of 57 countries, 56 if you exclude the very disputed Palestinian territories. Another one of the pan-Arab colors alongside black, red, and white, green is also common in Middle Eastern flags, with Iraq, Syria, Iran, Lebanon, the UAE, Kuwait, Oman, and Saudi Arabia being notable examples. However, unlike black, green is significantly more common outside the Middle East, with green also being used widely in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, although in many Latin American flags, the green isn't exactly easy to spot. Green is also moderately but not insanely popular in Europe, with the flags of Italy, Ireland, Bulgaria, Portugal, Hungary, Belarus, Lithuania, and even tiny San Marino all using some shade of green in their flag. This is, in part, due to green's strong symbolism in many countries, often being symbolic of green landscapes like in Ireland, agricultural capabilities like in Brazil, or of rebirth and new beginnings like in Nigeria. Green is the fifth most common flag color among national flags, as a whopping 97 countries use green in their flags. Another very common flag color used widely all over the world, yellow is one of the best flag colors out there for a few reasons. For one, unlike colors such as gray, yellow stands out, though not nearly as much as stronger colors like red or green. It still makes yellow easier to spot at a distance than, say, gray. Secondly, unlike purple, yellow dyes are relatively speaking cheap and yet are still aren't anywhere near as expensive as the purple dyes that were much more valuable, although a color being significantly cheaper than purple isn't saying much. However. Third, in many countries, yellow has strong symbolism, typically symbolizing either gold, prosperity, or riches, like in many countries where gold is mined, or hope for a better future, like in many sub-Saharan African flags. Now, as for the elephant in the room that is popularity in Europe, yellow is a popular choice among European flags, with Belgium, Lithuania, Germany, Bosnia, Sweden, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Romania, Spain, Moldova, and Ukraine in all having yellow not just as a side color, but as either the main color or one of the main colors. Yellow is the fourth most popular flag color among countries' flags, with 101 flags from around the world containing it. But even yellow isn't as popular as these last three colors, which I collectively like to call the quote-unquote big three. As the first of the quote-unquote big three of the most popular flag colors worldwide, blue synchronizes great with the other two of the big three, red and white, in several fantastic national flags just based on red, white, and blue. The reason for why blue and the other two colors are so common in flags, both historically and today, is because all three of these colors were adopted very early on by very influential countries. But even that's not totally it, as the reason why these influential powers adopted red, white, and blue so early on is because before the production of industrial dyes that allowed easy and cheap production of orange, yellow, and green dyes, red, white, and blue were the cheapest and most easily accessible dyes. As for symbolism, all three colors have deep symbolism, but since this section of the video talks about blue, let's keep it at that. Blue on flags usually symbolizes one of two things: the sea, or the concept of vigilance, loyalty, justice, and perseverance, the latter of which is the case with the flags of the UK, US, and probably even more. Blue is the third most common color on national flags worldwide, as 106 countries in total use blue on their flag. The second of the big three colors and second most common color on national flags, white is another really popular color that can be found on flags from all over the world. This popular flag color too has strong symbolism, as the color white is symbolic of peace, purity, and innocence, and when combined with the other big three colors, red and blue, who can again make some absolutely fantastic flags. Similar to the blue mentioned earlier, white was a popular choice for flags because the availability of its dyes beats most other colors before the production of industrial dyes. And because of this, just like with red and blue, white was a color adopted by influential powers very early on. And even today, with industrial dyes and readily available dyes of pretty much any color, red, white, and blue remain the most popular flag colors because, if we're being honest here, many flag designs that incorporate red, white, and blue are so good they're not worth changing. White is the second most popular color in national flags, with a whopping 145 countries using white in their flag. At this point, only one flag color is more popular, and it's the last color on this list. Finally, we come to red, the most popular color for use in flags, even more so than the other two of the quote-unquote big three colors. And if you're wondering where pink is, I decided to include it as a shade of red, as in some flags, being able to differentiate between pink and really light red is just about impossible for me. And so I decided to save myself the headache that way by just including pink alongside red. Anyways, as for symbolism, red can symbolize a few things. One of the most common of which is bloodshed, which makes sense for countries like the US and many African and Latin American countries set out to fight a colonial power for their sovereignty. Other things red can symbolize on a flag are valor, courage, and in some cases like China, Vietnam, and the now collapsed Soviet Union, communism. The deal as to why red is so popular is exactly the same as why white and blue are so common. Red dye was readily available long before industrial dyes, and the colors, red included, were adopted very early on by very influential powers who influenced many modern countries. Red is the most common color in national flags, as an absolutely staggering 156 countries use red or pink in their flag. Sticking to the theme of flags for this next one, this next video explains a topic not really readily explained by others. The presence of guns and firearms on national flags. 4 of them to be precise. Why do these 4 countries have guns in their flags? And what is the symbolism behind these flag firearms? Watch this video to find out. Now, firearms aren't exactly something you see on flags very often, but if you assume that all flags are free of any firearms, you're more wrong than someone who thinks a cigarette and a vape are the same darn thing. That's because, as it turns out, a total of 4 countries do in fact have 1 or more firearms on their flag and or coat of arms. So in today's video, we'll be talking about the 4 countries that have arm-bearing flags and the symbolism behind these flags' firearms. Okay, to start this video, there are a total of 4 countries who feature firearms in their flags and or coat of arms, with these 4 being Guatemala, Haiti, Bolivia, and Mozambique. Let's start with Guatemala. On the Guatemalan flag, the presence of firearms is relatively easy to spot. 2 crossed rifles featured in the coat of arms in the center of the flag. The reasoning for this is generally agreed upon. The rifles symbolize the country's will to defend itself against any aggressors. However, the rifles are more specifically Remington rifles, the type of rifle used during the country's liberal revolution in 1871, which means that the rifles symbolize the country won't just defend itself, but also its liberty from any aggressors by force if need be. So in the case of Guatemala, the rifles on the flag represent the country's willingness to defend itself and its liberty by force if it needs to. Next up, Haiti. Just like with Guatemala, the firearms are on the coat of arms, which is right in the center there, with the coat of arms containing 6 rifles and 2 cannons, as well as various other items and 6 civil flags. But getting back to the point, the weapons on the Haitian flag are often described as a, quote, trophy of weapons. And while yes, Haiti was and still is a dangerous country, that's not why there are firearms on the flag. In reality, the reason why firearms are on Haiti's flag is similar to why Guatemala has rifles on its flag. Defense, more specifically of the country's people and freedom. However, this next flag's firearms don't represent self-defense at all. Next up is Bolivia. The guns on the Bolivian flag are by no means easy to see. However, if you take a closer look at the coat of arms in the center, you can see them. 2 crossed rifles behind the oval shield. The reason for the firearms on the Bolivian flag actually has nothing to do with self-defense and everything to do with how Bolivia became a country to begin with. You see, Bolivia broke away from its Spanish colonizers by forceful violence, i.e., the Bolivian War of Independence. This is the symbolism behind those crossed rifles. They represent the struggles and hardships Bolivia went through during the war for its own independence. And last, but certainly not least, we have the country of Mozambique. The gun on this one is easy to see. An AK-47 featured directly on the flag. A lot of sources say that the gun stands for defense and vigilance. Others say it stands for the country's war for its independence. Others, however, debate it stands for violence and civil war and should be removed from the flag entirely. However, I'm not trying to make anyone mad, so I'll leave it at that. Now, if you were paying attention close enough, you may have noticed that none of the 4 countries with firearms in their flags are in Europe. But that's exactly where we're headed next, as this next video takes a relatively deep dive into the European continent's largest nations. Now, Europe is by no means a big continent, and being the second smallest of Earth's continents behind Australia, Europe is by far the continent most densely packed with countries for its size. But even amongst the teeny tiny countries like Monaco, Andorra, Liechtenstein, and the Vatican, there are giants that, while tiny on a global scale, are absolutely massive when you zoom down to the European scale. So without further ado, here are the 10 largest countries on the European continent. A country of rich culture, delicious food, and fine wine, Italy happens to be the 5th most visited country in the world, and is incredibly popular with tourists from all over Europe and the US. And rightfully so, as tourism in Italy employs more than 2 million Italians, and makes the country millions of euros annually, with tourism accounting for roughly 13% of the country's GDP. Weirdly enough, Italy also has not 1, but 2 microstates inside of it. San Marino and the Vatican. And here's something you probably didn't know. Christopher Columbus, yes, that same dude famous for discovering the Americas, was actually Italian, having been born in the city of Genoa in what's now Italy. Fun facts aside, even though the microstates inside Italy are tiny, the country itself is comparatively huge, with the country having a total area of 301,318 square kilometers. A country frequently regarded as Europe's giant punching bag, Poland, despite its size, was invaded in both world wars, successfully no less. But invasions aside, vodka, even though most notably drank in Russia, is actually not of Russian origin, but instead was actually invented in Poland. Poland isn't as dependent on tourism as most other European countries, even though it holds some pretty impressive feats to this day, like having the world's biggest castle and being home to many of Europe's largest animals, most notably the European bison, a species once on the brink of extinction that's now making a comeback, just like its American counterpart. And wouldn't you know it, the country with the most of them is Poland. Poland is a little bit bigger than Italy, with the country's total area being 312,685 square kilometers. Well known for holding the record of being the happiest country in the world for 6 years straight, Finland has a lot of reasons behind its happiness. Finland has an excellent education system, universal, not free however, healthcare, and several other services that all contribute to how happy the country is. And as if that wasn't enough, the capital of Finland, Helsinki, actually has the cleanest air of anywhere in the world, and Finland also holds other impressive feats. For example, Finns drink the most coffee of anywhere on Earth. The country has 2 million saunas, and yes, Finland has been the happiest country on earth for 6 years straight. And considering the excellent services, the high levels of trust between Finns, and the locals' appreciation of the simple things in life, it's not a huge surprise. Finland is the 8th biggest country in Europe, with Finland's total area being 338,145 square kilometers. Well known for its, less than peaceful past in both world wars, Germany today is nowhere near as violent as its past predecessors, Nazi Germany and the German Empire. German culture incorporates beer a lot, from the Oktoberfest to having the world's oldest brewery, and even having a secret beer code to order the drink. Germany, however, is not the country that drinks the most beer. That honor can go either to China, which has the highest overall beer consumption, or the Czech Republic, which has the highest per capita consumption. German is also the 5th most taught foreign language in the world, being beaten by Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, French, and English, and is spoken in not just Germany, but also Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Austria, and Luxembourg. Germany is one of the biggest countries in the European continent, with Germany having a total land area of 357,386 square kilometers. As one of the richest countries in the entire world, Norway has successfully managed to avoid the problems that usually plague countries with a lot of oil, most notably Venezuela. Norway is in what's known as the Nordics, a group of countries in Northern Europe that includes Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, one of which will appear further down this list. Norway is also incredibly safe to visit and live in, although I should warn you that you may find Norwegians rather cold if you come from a more gregarious culture, as the Nordics in general tend to be reserved and keep to themselves. And just like all of the Nordics, the country made the list of the top 10 happiest countries in the world yet again, with Norway ranking 7th in 2023. Norway is also rather big, with Norway having a total land area of 385,178 square kilometers. Traveling not very far at all, next up on this list is Sweden. The land border between Sweden and Norway is the longest in Europe, with the Norway-Sweden border having a total length of 1,620 kilometers. And if you wanted to know something really weird, Sweden actually imports garbage. That's right, because Swedish people generate very little garbage, there's no longer very much waste for Sweden to incinerate for energy. So as a solution, Sweden actually imports garbage from Norway and the UK to fuel the country's incinerators, which are used as the primary source of energy instead of oil and other fossil fuels. 49% of Sweden's waste ends up being incinerated, with 50% being recycled or composted, and the remaining only 1% of Sweden's garbage ending up in a landfill. Oh, and 57% of Sweden is still forested. So if a clean environment is what you're looking for, Sweden is the perfect place to find it. Sweden holds the title as the 5th largest country in Europe, with the country's total land area being 447,425 square kilometers. Claiming the title as the 4th largest country in Europe and 2nd most visited country in the world, we'll get to the most visited country in a second, is Spain. Spain's national anthem is the Marcha Real, which translates to Royal March, but that's not what's weird about it. What's weird is that the Spanish national anthem has no words. Yup, Spain is one of only 4 countries in the world whose national anthems have no words, with the others being Kosovo, San Marino, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Spain is also the world's largest producer of olive oil, producing just about twice as much as the next biggest producer, Italy. And as far as bullfighting, it is legal in most of Spain, except in the provinces of Catalonia and the Canary Islands. Other countries have also outlawed the practice, but I'm not going to get too deep in that. Like I said, Spain is huge, with the country's total land area being 498,511 square kilometers. The most visited country in the world and third largest in Europe, France has a lot to offer, from the Eiffel Tower to the Louvre, as well as food and fine wine. Given all of this, it comes as no surprise France is the single most visited country in the world, and a popular destination for tourists from all over the world. There's a lot of food-related quirks in this country, including the fact that French supermarkets aren't actually allowed to throw away food too close to the best by date and instead donate it to charity or food banks, or that France produces over 1,500 types of cheese, or that the French eat over 25,000 tons of escargot, that's snails by the way, annually. But going back to size, France is the largest country in the European Union and third largest in Europe, with France having a total area of 551,695 square kilometers. Now, despite the recent Russian annexation of the regions of Crimea and Donbass, these regions are still legally Ukrainian, so I will still count Crimea and the Donbass region as part of Ukraine. But war business aside, Ukraine has a surprising lot of culture under its belt. You know Chernobyl, right? Well, that nuclear disaster occurred in Ukraine, and you can actually visit that site, although you will need a permit. But nuclear waste aside, this country is also called the breadbasket of Europe, and rightfully so, as Ukraine is not only one of the largest exporters of wheat, barley, and corn, but is also the biggest producer of sunflower seeds and sunflower oil. Not surprising, considering the sunflower is Ukraine's national flower. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe, with a total area of 603,628 square kilometers. Finally, we come to the Russian Federation, the biggest country in Europe and the world. Not too surprisingly, Russia is a transcontinental country, with Russia spanning both Europe and Asia. 40% of Europe's area is occupied by the European portion of Russia, which, mind you, also contains 75% of Russia's population, and largely due to the fact that the Asian part of Russia, what we'd call Siberia, is basically an unlivable frozen hellhole for most of the year. Two of the biggest cities in Russia, the capital Moscow and as well as St. Petersburg, are located in European Russia, as is 9 other cities out of 13 in Russia that have over 1 million residents. And speaking of Moscow, I bet you didn't know that Moscow has the most billionaires per capita of any city. And as you may already know, Russia is huge. The European portion alone has an area of 3,969,100 square kilometers, let alone the entire country's gigantic area of 17,071,242 square kilometers, making Russia not only the biggest country in Europe, but also the biggest country in the world. Staying in Europe for this next video, you've probably heard the types of Americans always demanding people in other countries speak English. But while it might not seem like it on the outside, some places in Europe actually speak really good English. So now you might be wondering, which of the many countries in Europe can speak the best English on the continent? Check out this next video to learn more. Now, it's almost a running joke at this point that us Americans, and Brits for that matter, you're not safe, always seem to demand that locals speak English when abroad. But when it comes down to it, Europe actually has a lot of English speakers. So in today's video, I'll be talking about the top 10 European nations with the highest percentage of their population that can speak English. So without further ado, let's get to the— Wait a minute! Now, before we begin, I should state that I am including countries where English is an official, or at least de facto official language within Europe, meaning Malta, Ireland, and the United Kingdom will all be on this list at some point. A beautiful country in the Alps directly bordering the relatively similar country of Switzerland, Austria, particularly the capital Vienna, is a major tourist hotspot, with Austria almost making it into the top 10 most visited countries worldwide. Link to that list in the description below. And because of English being frequently taught in school so that communication with English-speaking tourists is made easy, the country's overall booming tourism industry, particularly in Vienna, the Austrians' English is surprisingly good. However, that does not necessarily mean you'll be spoken to in English just because you're a foreigner. As while Austria's English skills are still better than most of Europe's, German is still the official language. So if you're planning a trip to there anytime soon, just please, don't hold your breath with just English and at least learn some basic German. Even so, Austria has the 10th most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, with 73% of Austrians having fluency in the English language. A tiny, often forgot about country right next to its much larger neighbor Belgium, Luxembourg is what I like to call a quote-unquote Frankenstein nation, as Luxembourg has lots of influence from more influential countries or regions nearby, which is shown by the fact that even though Luxembourgish is the main language in the country, German and French are also official languages and really common, due to influence from Germany and Wallonia, the French-speaking part of Belgium that borders Luxembourg. However, there's actually two other languages that, although not official, are surprisingly common: Portuguese and, you guessed it, English. This insane linguistic diversity is in large part because, similar to many of Europe's other relatively small countries like Liechtenstein and Switzerland, Luxembourg is a country of foreigners, with almost half of the Luxembourgish population being foreign-born, and as such, Luxembourg has the 9th most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, as around 80% of Luxembourgers can speak fluent English. A country very well known for being good with English speakers, it should come as no surprise that the Swedes speak some of the best English in Europe. But there's actually a kind of depressing reason why. And that reason is that compared to languages like English, French, German, or Spanish, Swedish is rarely spoken outside of Sweden, and since a lot of the media in Sweden is in English anyway, it pays to know English for much of the Swedish population. As for tourists, this can prove especially handy, as most tourists in Sweden, I'd assume, don't know Swedish, and the Swedes being so good at the English language means that tourists rarely have to communicate in and learn Swedish, although doing so is often encouraged. When it comes down to it, however, foreigners are rarely expected to speak Swedish, and more often than not, you can get by just fine with English, as Sweden has the 8th most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, as around 86% of the Swedish population bears fluency in the English language. Now, the Nordics in general have some of the highest English fluency rates in Europe, and Denmark is absolutely no exception. This is in part because, similar to Sweden's, a lot of Denmark's media is foreign, and Danish is seldom used in foreign media, which is predominantly in English. And so many learn English to adapt to the heavy consumption of English-dominated foreign media. But there's actually one thing I forgot to mention when talking about Sweden, and it's that, just like in Sweden, In Denmark, it's actually mandatory for schools to teach both written and spoken English as subjects, and as such, is mandatory for Danes, and Swedes for that matter, to learn from a young age. And unsurprisingly, being taught English alongside Danish from a young age means that despite Danish being the typical language in Denmark, many Danes have excellent fluency in the English language, and you'll pretty much have no problems getting around with just English if you're a foreigner. Although, just like with the case of Sweden and Swedish, learning a few basic Danish phrases is recommended. Denmark has the seventh most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, as 86% of Danes are at least somewhat fluent in English. Although you'd probably never expect a tiny Mediterranean island to be on a list like this, Malta is exactly that, and today, English is one of the nation's two official languages, with the other being Maltese, both of which are mandatory school subjects. And while you'd think that Maltese would be more common, English is actually really common, being the written language of legal documents and being spoken widely, though rarely as a native language, with most Maltese people learning English from a young age because, again, English is a mandatory school subject alongside Maltese and is one of the country's official languages. The other reason that English is so common in Malta is because Malta was originally a British crown colony, and English was already spoken, written, and used very widely by the time of Maltese independence, so it stuck around, eventually becoming an official language. Today, Malta has the sixth most English speakers relative to its population, with 88% of the Maltese population being fluent in the English language. The second best of the Nordic countries and fifth best in Europe for English proficiency, Norway, just like the other Nordic countries, is very English friendly. And you can get around in Norway just about trouble-free using just English. This is in part because, just like in Denmark and Sweden, English is a mandatory school subject, but also because a lot of the media the Norwegian people watch isn't translated into Norwegian, and as such, Norwegians get exposed to even more English in TV and the media, which, unsurprisingly, are predominantly in English. That said, many Norwegians also regularly oblige to practice their English, seemingly particularly with foreigners, and it's not uncommon to see Norwegians switch to English when talking to foreigners, even if said foreigner is learning Norwegian. And because of all of this, it's unsurprising that Norway has the fifth most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, as 90% of the Norwegian populace is fluent in English. While you might not expect the Dutch to be this good when it comes to English fluency, assuming you're not Dutch yourself, sorry for any Dutch viewers watching, the Netherlands is actually one of the countries that are the most fluent in English, beating Denmark and Sweden and being tied with Norway when it comes to English proficiency within the populace. Even almost beating the United States, 93% of Americans fluent in the English language. There are a few reasons why the Dutch have English skills that are straight up unparalleled compared to most of Europe. For one, trade is something the Dutch have always done, both then and now, giving the Dutch lots of exposure to English through cultural exchange. Secondly, while the subtitles in Dutch media are in Dutch, the audio is in English, making exposure to English from media that's largely English dominated all too easy. The Netherlands has the fourth most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, with 90% of the Dutch population bearing fluency in English. As a nation that's ultra dependent on foreign trade, Iceland is a country where English is even more common than not, even having more English speakers relative to its population than the United States and being tied with Canada. Sorry for the many Americans and Canadians that are probably watching this right now. This is because, like I said, Iceland is very, very, very dependent on international trade. And with Iceland's population being so small, there is absolutely no way in Satan's basement that the countries that Iceland trades with would ever go through the trouble of learning Icelandic. Not only that, but Iceland is also massively foreign, with almost a fifth of Iceland's population being foreigners, making many other languages, but English especially, really common. Iceland has the third most English speakers relative to population, as a whopping 98% of Icelanders are fluent in English. Although Ireland is excluded by some lists like this due to having English as an official language, for the all intensive purposes of this list, I'm including the 3 countries in Europe that have English as an official language: Malta, Ireland, and the last country on this list. Now, the reason for why English became such a common language while the original native language of the island, Irish Gaelic, is so rare nowadays is actually really sad. But in short, Britain's extreme hostility to the Irish during the already bad Irish potato famine that was sweeping the island at the time forced many of those who didn't leave or die to learn English. Never mind the fact that the speaking of Irish was heavily suppressed by British rule over the island up until Irish independence in 1922. But Britain's linguistic mark on the Irish never really left, however. And even post-independence, English slowly but surely replaced Irish in most of the country, and today, Ireland has the second most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, with 98% of the Irish population being fluent in English. Finally, we get to the very country that spread English all over the world through its empire larger than any other in history, the United Kingdom. Strangely enough, however, English is not an official language in the UK. Not because it's not spoken, but because the UK, just like its much larger quote-unquote son, the USA, doesn't have any official languages. But if either the UK or US did, English would be it, or in the case of the USA, most likely only one of them. But official languages, or the lack thereof, aside, the UK was the original country that spread English around the world. First spreading it to North America before losing a war that created the US, and then to Asia, Africa, South America, and Oceania through Britain's ginormous empire, and finally spread English to the rest of Europe after said empire collapsed. The UK has the most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, unsurprisingly, with over 98% of Brits holding fluency in the English language. So, now that I've covered which nations can speak the best English in Europe, let's talk other languages. Europe, as most of you should know, is a very linguistically diverse place, but some languages on the continent, and in the world for that matter, are a whole lot easier to learn than others for Anglophones like me and probably most of you. This next video explains the easiest languages to learn for English speakers, and why they're so easy. Now, learning a new language seems hard, and it really is. But if you're just getting started, and are a native English speaker like me, consider trying out one of these top 10 comparatively really easy languages. In today's video, I'll be talking about the top 10 easiest languages to learn for English speakers. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Now, when it comes down to it, Most of what makes Danish harder than Swedish and Norwegian is pronunciation, as Danish is often reported to be significantly harder to pronounce than the other two. In fact, there are quite a few people that'll actually say that pronouncing Danish makes you sound like you're drunk, as the language has an insanely relaxed pronunciation. There are other things that make Danish comparatively hard, including but not limited to word or genders and word order. But even so, Danish grammar and sentences are actually really easy. See, it's actually the pronunciation that makes the language all the harder compared to the other Nordic languages. And believe me, the pronunciation really makes the language a pain to learn. But pronunciation aside, Danish is actually surprisingly easy for English speakers, even though it's not as easy as Norwegian or Swedish. While learning Romanian, similar to German, seems nothing more like a pipe dream for most who have English as their mother tongue, you'll actually be very relieved to know that Romanian is actually quite easy. Just like English, most Romanian vocabulary has Latin roots, but it actually has closer ties to languages like Spanish, French, Italian, and Portuguese, due to all five being Romance languages. So if you can also speak Spanish, Italian, or any of the Romance languages, you've already got a head start. Pronunciation isn't too difficult, but please be aware that learning it too late can lead to mistakes or trip-ups in the long run. So it's best to learn Romanian early. And while the grammar can be difficult as well, it's still unlikely native English speakers will have that hard of a time. I'm learning such a surprisingly easy language. If you're looking to travel to Europe but don't want to learn several different languages, then German might just be your lucky ticket. It's not just used in Germany, but also in Austria, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, making learning it ideal if you want to travel to any of these countries. Fortunately, however, German is actually nowhere near as hard as people say, and is actually quite easy. Sure, it's most definitely not a walk in the park, but it's still pretty easy. The grammar is relatively easy, with clear, straightforward rules and recognizable patterns, and the fact that English and German are both Germanic languages makes it all the easier. And while it can seem really hard at first, once you get past that hard part, it should be relatively smooth sailing from there. So while German is definitely not a cakewalk, the language still is comparatively speaking really easy. As a language that seems very similar to Spanish, Portuguese still holds the record as one of the easiest languages to learn for English speakers, particularly so if you already know and or speak Spanish, as Portuguese and Spanish have a lot of similarities. Similar to many languages on this list, the language's grammar and conjugations are, similar to in Spanish, very simple, and the vocabulary is very straightforward, most definitely more so than other languages. And even though, just like Romanian, Portuguese isn't a Germanic language like English, there are still plenty of Portuguese words that are similar to English ones, as both share roots with Latin, directly so in the case of Portuguese and indirectly so in the case of English. However, like German and some other languages on this list, word genders can be tough, especially if you speak a gender-neutral language like English, but overall, Portuguese is pretty easy. As one of the most widely taught second languages by schools here in the US, French is easily rather popular as a second language, right up there alongside German and Spanish. The good news is that French is really easy, as the English language itself actually borrowed a lot of words from French, and as such, many of the spellings, pronunciations, and meanings of French words should come to you very easy. And even from day one, it's surprisingly easy to get started. Unlike other languages, where getting started is one of the harder parts. And while French isn't a Germanic language like some of the others on this list, and thus isn't that closely related to English, like I said before, a lot of English words were borrowed from French, so the words are pretty easy. As for the grammar, it's harder but not too hard, and French is overall a pretty easy language for English speakers. Just like French and Portuguese, Italian is not a Germanic language, and not exactly very close to English, instead being a Romance language alongside Spanish, Portuguese, among others. Despite this, English borrows more than a quarter of its words either directly or indirectly from Latin, oftentimes through a Romance language, most notably French, which is only one of the reasons why Italian is so easy. Another is how similar the vocabulary is. Many Italian words are exactly the same or very similar to their English counterparts, and as such, Italian becomes surprisingly easy after you start noticing these words. However, not all Italian words are similar. Some are very different, but enough are similar to make learning the language easy. See, well, easier. As for the grammar, it's not that hard, although you may find it a tad bit harder than some of the other languages' grammar. In summary, Italian is one of the easiest languages for English speakers and most definitely deserves a spot on this list. Being sort of a mashup between English and German, Dutch is undoubtedly one of the easiest languages to learn for English speakers. One of the biggest reasons is similarity to English, as Dutch is a Germanic language just like English and German, and so if you know or speak either, you're in for a surprisingly easy time. And what makes Dutch that much easier is that, just like with French, a lot of English words were borrowed from Dutch. And it goes the other way around too, as many Dutch words are similar or the same as English. And as such, getting started is really easy, just like French. However, like all languages, there are hard parts. For one, just like Danish, Dutch pronunciation is a nightmare, as the language is full of insane letter combinations, and the sometimes crazy word order also doesn't help. Overall, however, Dutch is comparatively easy, arguably even more so if English is your mother tongue. Being the second most spoken language in the world after Mandarin Chinese, Spanish is far and away an incredibly useful language to learn. And luckily for native English speakers, Spanish is an incredibly easy language to learn. One thing that makes Spanish comparatively easy is that it's a phonetic language, meaning the words are pronounced just like how they're written. Spanish grammar, too, is relatively easy, see, compared to other languages, but I warn you, it's still not exactly a cakewalk. As for genders, Spanish is gendered, but similar to Dutch, Spanish has two genders for nouns, masculine and feminine, and unlike German, there are no gender-neutral nouns. And although you may not suspect it at first, many Spanish words are somewhat similar to their English counterparts, making for an overall very easy language for native English speakers. As a Germanic language just like English, it's no surprise that Swedish is comparatively really easy for English speakers. The grammar is fairly simple, but the pronunciation, although nowhere near as hard as Danish, can still trip up newbies if they're not careful. But because it's a Germanic language, just like in Dutch or German, a lot of words in Swedish are similar or the same as in English. And going back to grammar, Swedish sentence structure is also rather simple, so mastering it isn't too hard. However, even though the words are usually easy, there are some words that sound so different from their English meaning that they can easily throw you off, especially those annoying, unfamiliar compound words. But some particularly annoying hard parts aside, Swedish is a language comparatively easy to learn. and for not just English speakers, but also speakers of other Nordic languages, like the last language on this list. Finally, we've come to the easiest language for English speakers to learn, that being Norwegian. It shouldn't be much of a surprise at all considering it's a Germanic language and shares a lot of words either in common with or very similar to English, and as such, the basics are anything but hard. And speaking of the basics, once you have them down, the rest of the language should be comparatively pretty easy, especially in the case of grammar, in which once you get the basics down, the rest of the grammar comes more naturally and is easier to pick up. Pronunciation, on the other hand, is probably the hardest part of the language, as just like with Swedish, Norwegian most definitely has its fair share of words more than ready to trip you up with pronunciation. Overall, however, Norwegian is one of, if not the easiest language for an English speaker, and definitely worth a shot even if you're not moving to Norway anytime soon. Zooming back out from a European scale to a global one, it's also noteworthy that many European nations are economic powerhouses on their own, never mind as part of the economic giant that is the EU. But plenty of non-European countries have huge economies. So watch this next video to learn about the economies of the countries with the top 10 largest economies worldwide. Economies. Every country has one, but some have grown to be much bigger than others. So in this video, we'll be talking about the countries with the top 10 largest economies in the world. Now, before we start, we'll be measuring the size of a country's economy by its GDP, or gross domestic product, in US dollars. And mind you, GDP overall is not the same as GDP per capita, which instead refers to how rich a country is compared to its population. But without further ado, let's just get started. Despite the nation's low population and freezing winters that make agriculture difficult, the Canadian economy is a huge one on the world stage, although not even close to the economic titan right on their southern border, but more on them later. And despite agriculture being borderline impossible in a lot of the country, Canada makes up for it with a gigantic service sector and plenty of oil and metals such as aluminum, indium, gold, zinc, copper, niobium, and nickel, a lot of which are used extensively around the world. Never mind the nation's almost complete monopoly over the world's supply of maple syrup, as well as exporting lots of wood, which are important but not at an existential level. After all of this, it's no longer a surprise as the Canadian economy is the 10th largest worldwide, with a GDP of $2.12 trillion. Being huge, heavily populated, and absolutely perfect for economic development with its rich natural resources, Brazil is the economic giant of South America, and once you look at it from an economic standpoint, it's not hard to see why. The country is full of natural resources, and a warm climate, huge land area, and fertile soil makes it prime territory for farming some of the most ridiculously profitable crops and livestock, such as cattle, coffee, cotton, corn, soybeans, tobacco, and sugar, alongside others, and is surprisingly rich in crude oil and metal ores, never mind services such as tourism as well as foreign investment. All things considered, Brazil has the world's 9th largest economy, with a GDP of $2.13 trillion. Despite the Italian economy having been absolutely wrecked by World War II, Italy today is one of the world's strongest economies. But how, might you ask? Well, for one, the Italian economy post-World War II was soon booming after what's known as the Italian economic miracle, which was caused by a combination of a booming industrial sector and increasing openness to trading with the international market, both of which caused the nation to go from poor and war-torn to rich and recovered. However, the miracle didn't affect everywhere in Italy evenly, as while northern and central Italy rapidly industrialized and got rich, southern Italy did not, and even today remains the poorest part of the nation. The country today has the world's 8th largest economy, with a GDP of $2.19 trillion. This time on the winning side of both world wars, France's economy is still going really strong, and for some unexpected reasons. Well, kind of. Remember in my video, Top 10 Most Visited Countries, that I mentioned that France is the world's most visited country? Well, it sure pays off, as tourism is a massive sector in the French economy, and a whopping 10% of France's GDP is generated by visitors. However, France isn't just making money off tourism, as France also has a strong manufacturing sector, as well as being a big exporter of pharmaceutical products. This, however, is nothing compared to the revenue generated by the French service sector, which is dominated by tourism but also encompasses financial and insurance activities as well as real estate. The French economy is the 7th largest globally and 2nd largest in the European Union post-Brexit, with a GDP of $3.05 trillion. Despite it having been comparatively absolutely wrecked by Brexit, the UK's economy still remains one of the strongest worldwide, and unsurprisingly has been one of the strongest for a while now, especially under the empire, with the economy having been fueled by trade with India as well as the highly lucrative trade of sugar and slaves in West Africa. Even after the empire collapsed, however, the British economy is surprisingly large, now being an economy fueled by trade and manufacturing while also specializing in banking and finance. However, similar to Italy's case, the wealth is very unevenly distributed, as the vast majority of the country's wealth is concentrated in London, with most of the UK being surprisingly poor. That said, the economic capital of London makes the British economy the world's 6th strongest, with a GDP of $3.33 trillion. Originally, arguably the crown jewel of the British Empire up until its independence, India's economy is surprisingly large and is only expected to grow in the near future. With a huge population that just surpassed even China's, India's rapid economic growth is greatly fueled by a combination of two things: investments and domestic consumption. India also has a huge manufacturing sector, with labor arguably even cheaper than China's, only contributing to the country's status as a manufacturing giant. The country also focuses heavily on oil, which you'd probably never expect, but then again, oil can be found all over the world, so any country could strike it rich at some point. Those aside, the country also exports tons of iron, steel, and rice, which further fuels the Indian economy. The nation has the 5th largest economy in the world, with a GDP of $3.73 trillion. Another former Axis power that, like Italy, got absolutely f***ed during and after World War II, Japan has underwent an amazing transformation to one of the world's largest economies. This transformation from a war-torn, nuked twice, and struggling country to a modernized, rich, and thriving one was, like Italy's, caused by an economic miracle. More specifically, the Japanese economic miracle. This was made possible by a variety of factors, some of which included post-war US subsidies, increasing capital, a young, well-educated labor force, and reopening to the international market. Today, the Japanese economy specializes in manufacturing and services, particularly in the production of electronics used all over the world, and is the fourth largest economy worldwide with a GDP of $4.23 trillion. The third and last former Axis power, which was on the losing side of both wars and got absolutely screwed both times, Germany has made an astounding recovery after World War II, which manifested in an economic miracle just like in the other two former Axis powers, which was caused by various factors, most notably an influx of foreign aid, economic policies that helped in rebuilding the German economy, the country's industrial prowess that could now be used to grow the economy instead of for war, and a young, hard-working labor force that would lead the charge to rebuild the nation. Today, Germany's economy is huge and the third largest globally, with a GDP of $4.43 trillion. As one of the world's oldest countries, China has been overshadowed on the world stage for a long time. Until recently, in which the country's economy has switched from agriculture to manufacturing and services, and as such, the Chinese economy was booming and still is. Even today, it's pretty much impossible to walk around your house and not find a Made in China label at least somewhere. Which is quite the testament to how China really does live up to its reputation as the factory of the world. And to make things even better, China has a really strong monopoly on the world's supply of rare earth metals. And while that is important, it's not anywhere near as important as China's now booming industrial and service sectors. This economic boom places modern China as having the world's second largest economy, with a GDP of $17.70 trillion. But before we get to the world's largest economy, here are some honorable mentions. Russia, $1.86 trillion. Mexico, $1.81 trillion. South Korea, $1.71 trillion. Australia, $1.69 trillion. Spain, $1.58 trillion. And now, finally, we come to my homeland, the US of A, whose economy accounts for over a quarter of the world's GDP. And this big economy is so big for many advantages that unfortunately some other countries aren't as lucky to have, such as not being ravaged by constant wars, having boatloads of natural resources, a huge population, and stable and well-developed financial systems and institutions. All things considered, the American economy is very diverse, although the vast majority of the US's GDP is from services, which also includes insurance, real estate, finance, and professional and business services, while sectors like industry and agriculture play smaller but still important roles. Unsurprisingly, the American economy is the largest globally, with a GDP of $26.95 trillion. Finally, to wrap up this compilation, let's talk one of the biggest sectors of many countries' economies: tourism. Some countries get way more tourists than others. So what are the most visited countries by tourists worldwide? Watch this next video to find out. Tourism. It's a big part in many countries' economy and generates a lot of money for countries all over the world. But not all countries get an equal share of tourists, as some countries receive a whole hell of a lot more visitors than others. So without further ado, here are Here are the world's top 10 most visited countries. Oh, the glorious United Kingdom. Well, it may not be obvious that the UK is full of tourists. Compared to other countries, the UK is actually really popular with foreign visitors, and for good reason. The country's rich history, amazing architecture, famous fashion, and intriguing culture are big magnets for tourists. And the abundance of pubs and alcohol all over Great Britain and Northern Ireland is no secret among both locals and tourists. And while the monarchy's impact on tourism and the British economy is debatable, places related to the royal family still attract millions of tourists and in the process generate millions of pounds worth of tourist money. The UK ranks as the 10th most visited country in the world, with the country receiving an average of 39.4 million international tourist arrivals annually. Well known for its beer, the Brandenburg Gate, and a ton of other things that don't start with B, Germany is another country that happens to be a magnet for foreign tourists. And with rich history, natural beauty, and culture, it's not hard to see why. Tourist attractions like the Bavarian Alps and the Neuschwanstein, or however you pronounce it, castle, are only the tip of the iceberg, as the cities too are popular with tourists and visitors, some of the most popular of which are the capital Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Cologne. Oh, and who can forget Munich's Oktoberfest, an autumn festival that features lots, and I mean lots, of drinking German beer. So please, be very careful if you can't hold your booze. Now, some lists might put Thailand as the 9th most visited country instead of the 8th, but based off the websites I used to research this video, Germany is the 9th most visited country in the world, receiving an average of 39.6 million international tourist arrivals annually. Thailand. It's a beautiful country from all angles, but with beauty comes tourists, and lots of them too. The country is pretty much renowned the world over for its beauty, from its Buddhist temples and beautiful beaches to other natural beauty in its jungles and mountains. This makes the country pretty much a giant magnet for tourists from all over the world to come and visit. And with plenty of magnificent cities, but most notably the capital Bangkok as well, it's easy to figure out why Thailand is so popular with tourists. Oh, and please don't forget about the locals. The locals of Thailand are known for being friendly to and warmly welcoming foreigners, hence Thailand's other name, the Land of Smiles. All things considered, it's no surprise that the country is a huge tourism hotspot, and the 8th most visited country in the world, as Thailand receives an average of 39.8 million international tourist arrivals annually. A vibrant hotspot of cuisine, culture, and beauty right on our southern border. I live in the US, by the way. Mexico is a beautiful country with loads to offer for travelers. And the millions of tourists who visit the country also make it one of the most visited countries in the world at that. And for good reason, too. From Mayan ruins and fabulous beaches to an alluring culture and vibrant cities such as Cancun and the capital Mexico City, the country is a treasure trove for visitors, being among the most tourist-friendly countries in the world and, like I said earlier, having a lot of incentives to visit. The country's vibrant nightlife, especially in Cancun, as well as its fascinating culture and fiery but delicious food, would make it all the more attractive as a destination for tourists. The country is the 7th most visited country in the world, with Mexico receiving an average of 45 million international tourist arrivals annually. Similar to other countries in the Mediterranean region like Greece, Cyprus, and Italy, Turkey is simply bursting with vibrant culture, history, and beauty from all angles. Its historical sites make it an excellent choice for history buffs, Its natural beauty cannot be ignored, and while bigger cities like the actually not the capital Istanbul and the actual capital Ankara aren't exactly known for their beauty, it's almost entirely because of bad planning despite historically having an incredible architectural heritage and beautiful historic buildings. But not so beautiful cities aside, Turkey still takes the spot as the sixth most visited country in the world, with the country receiving an average of 51.2 million international tourist arrivals annually. Staying in the Mediterranean for this next one, next up is Italy, a country that, just like Cyprus, Greece, or Turkey, is an absolute goldmine for history buffs, especially when you consider that the Italian peninsula was the beating heart of ancient Rome. History aside, though, Italy has a lot more to offer, from delicious food and a warm Mediterranean climate to beautiful cities and more. After all this, it's no surprise that Italy is a hotspot for tourism. Such a big hotspot, in fact, that certain areas are literally being overrun with tourists. Most notably Venice, which has already banned cruises from entering the fragile Venice Lagoon, and may take further action in the future to tame tourism in the region. All things considered, it's still not surprising Italy is the fifth most visited country in the world, with the country receiving an average of 64.5 million international tourist arrivals annually. Next up is arguably one of the oldest countries in the world, China. The country's rich history and culture attract lots of tourists, and who can forget the extremely popular tourist attraction that is the Great Wall of China? But there's actually a lot more to the country than just its ancient history and culture, as the country is also full of stunning landscapes, and has cuisine and gastronomical wonders arguably even better than the Chinese food here in America. Oh, and do not forget the extremely developed and actually really safe big cities in eastern China, the most popular with visitors of which is Shanghai, but the capital Beijing comes in second, followed by Guangzhou, Shan, or however you pronounce that one, and Hangzhou. China ranks as the fourth most visited country in the world, as China receives an average of 65.7 million international tourist arrivals annually. Ah, the United States of America. A huge country that's also actually quite popular with tourists. Now, if you live in the US, you may take it for granted, but the USA is actually huge. And being so big comes with a lot of tourist attractions. From museums and cities to cultural diversity and famous landmarks, the US abounds in reasons to visit, especially considering that safety concerns for visitors are actually way overblown. And having been born in the US, I can tell you that no, the US isn't full of racists out to kill you, and no, most areas aren't actually as dangerous as you'd believe, as most of the crime in the US is concentrated in a few very small areas that tourists avoid anyway. The US of A takes the title as the third most visited country in the world, as America receives an average of 79.3 million international tourist arrivals annually. Similar to Italy, certain areas of Spain, most notably Barcelona, are suffering under the weight of so many tourists, and there have even been attacks and protests against tourists, quote unquote, invading the city. That being said, however, most of Spain is still perfectly safe, and quite popular too. Spain's warm climate, beautiful cities with amazing architecture, delicious food, and fabulous beaches all combine to make Spain a tourist magnet. Although I should warn you, whatever you do, do not go to the beaches or the Spanish island of Mallorca, or Mallorca in English, during peak tourist season, unless fighting hundreds on hundreds of drunk British tourists just for a spot at the beach is your kind of vacation. That aside, however, Spain is still overall a wonderful destination, and is the second most visited country in the world, receiving an average of 83.7 million international tourist arrivals annually. Finally, we come to France, a country known all too well among tourists from all over the world, with delicious food, beautiful scenery, exquisite culture, and people that are actually nicer than you think, outside of Paris at least. It's no surprise that France is incredibly popular among visitors, with the capital Paris holding the title as the most visited city in the world. That said, however, France is a lot more than just Paris, as there are plenty of other big cities that are definitely worth visiting, like Lyon, Toulouse, Marseille, and Montpellier. And when you combine it with a rich history and fine art and architecture, most notably the Eiffel Tower in Paris as well as the Louvre, you get a country that has pretty much everything necessary to become a tourist magnet. France holds the title as the most visited country in the world, receiving an average of 89.4 million international tourist arrivals annually. So there you have it, a compilation in celebration of my channel's second anniversary. We hope you enjoyed watching this video. As always, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!